abdomen, Dr. Escobar has been lecturing to you on different abdominal organs and blood supply and those kinds of things. One of the main contents of the abdomen, as you already are aware, is the digestive tract. Most of the digestive tract is in the abdomen, so that's why we chose abdomen as a time to look at digestion. So we're going to look at the histology of the gastrointestinal tract during our first hour this morning, and then during the second hour we'll focus on the histology of the liver and the pancreas, which are accessory organs to the digestive tract. And suddenly, all right, so the digestive system is made up of a series of spaces or tubular structures which form what we call the digestive tract. So that begins at the oral cavity. Food goes from the oral cavity to a little tubular structure called the pharynx, which is just posterior to the oral cavity, what lay people would call the throat. And then from there moves to the esophagus and into the stomach, into the small intestine, into the large intestine. And what can't get digested and utilized is expelled through the anus, as you're all aware. All right, there are several accessory glands. We have the salivary glands in the oral, associated with the oral cavity. And then we have the liver and pancreas, which both produce secretions that are secreted into the digestive tract and that help the digestive process. All right, the digestive tract is also, why is my thing cut off? This is bad. I don't know what's going on here. I tried to get these lateral screens to work, but anyway, I think the problem is the format of my slide is longer than the format of the screen, so it's chopping me off. Sorry about that, but you got a picture there. The digestive tract can also be called the gastrointestinal tract. Another name for it is alimentary canal. Alimentation means food, eating, that type of thing. All right, so the purpose of digestion, as you're probably aware, is to obtain molecules necessary for procuring energy and also raw materials from which to build various other molecules in the body for growth and bodily functions. So large molecules such as proteins, complex carbohydrates, and fats are broken down into smaller molecules. Their components such as amino acids, simple sugars, triglycerides, and so forth. And then these are absorbed primarily in the small intestine, and then they are utilized by the various cells and organs throughout the body. So the purpose of the digestive tract is to obtain the raw materials that we need to run the body, to build other molecules, to keep things going, and so forth, and to provide energy. All right, water and electrolytes typically get absorbed in the large intestine. So digestion per se doesn't typically take place in the large intestine, but there's still an important function there. Now, we've learned the word mucosa, so let's review that term. Remember, a mucosa is somewhat similar to skin in that you have two major components. You have an epithelial layer, and then deep to the epithelium you have a connective tissue support. Okay? So in the skin we call the epithelial layer what? Epidermis. And what do we call the support connective tissue under the epidermis? Dermis. Okay? So those two layers would be equivalent to mucosa in other tissues. So again, we'll have an epithelial layer. It won't be stratified squamous probably, except for esophagus. And then under that, we will have a connective tissue support that has blood vessels and all those kinds of things. All right? So that constitutes mucosa. So the mucosa of the digestive tract serves as a protective barrier between the contents of the digestive tract and the surrounding tissues. All right? So that's another important function. All right, so what does the digestive tract do? We have multiple steps that take place. The first step is ingestion. That just simply means taking the food in. Okay? So putting food, putting drink, putting fluid in your mouth, that's ingestion. And then we have mastication. Now we're going to have a whole lecture later on mastication. Dr. Goodacre, who was the former dean of the dental school for many years, he's a prosthodontist, and he has a lecture on mastication and deglutition, which means swallowing. So that's coming up a little later. So this picture that I put on the screen is showing muscles of mastication. And then we have the movement of ingested materials through the digestive tract through the function of various muscles. So remember, well, I guess you don't remember because we haven't talked about it yet, but the walls of the digestive tract are formed of a couple layers of muscle. One layer is circularly oriented. The other layer is longitudinally oriented. So they do a combination of squeezing and pushing. So the food gets squished, but it also gets moved forward. We call that peristalsis. And so that's what you're seeing in this picture here. You're seeing the tube sort of contract and push the food forward. And so the only way that the food can move is through this peristalsis function. All right, secretion. So we have mucus, we have enzymes, we have acids, we have bile, so various things that aid the digestive process. So that's another important function. We have the release of hormones. We don't often include the digestive tract as an endocrine organ. And when we study endocrinology, we don't often talk about the digestive tract, but it is actually an endocrine organ. All along the digestive tract, we have endocrine cells embedded in the epithelium that are producing hormones, and those hormones specifically act on the digestive tract to promote various aspects of digestion. So gastrin, cholecystokinin, you'll learn them all in physiology if you haven't done so yet. But anyway, that's another important function. We have the actual digestion process, which is the chemical breakdown under the influence of acids and enzymes and so forth into smaller molecules. And then the digested material has to be absorbed into the bloodstream, carried to the different tissues and organs of the body. And finally, we have elimination of the undigestible material. And we all know how that happens. All right, there we go. All right, so this picture from your textbook, which I hope you've all purchased, there's a new edition that just recently came out. It's called Junkera's Basic Histology. It's a very good textbook. In fact, we're using the same textbook this year with the medical students. So you and them have the same text. This is a picture from the textbook, and it's showing this is a generalized picture of the digestive tract. So this isn't any one specific organ or region, but it's showing you the various layers. So what we'll do is we'll start from the inside and work our way out toward the outside. I'm just going to talk you through this picture, and then we'll go through with some slides that have text on them. So let's look at this picture first. So the innermost layer is a layer of epithelium. In the esophagus, we're going to see that epithelium is stratified squamous. But when we get to the rest of the digestive tract, it's going to be simple columnar for the most part. I mean, you can write that down now if you want to, but we'll go through each region and we'll talk about its specific epithelium when we get there. Deep to the epithelium is going to be a basal lamina, of course. We always have that under an epithelium. And then we'll have a layer of connective tissue, which we call the lamina propria. I think we've already been introduced to that term, lamina propria. So that's the supportive connective tissue. Now, in most organ systems in the body, mucosa only consists of those two things, epithelium and lamina propria. But in the digestive tract, and only in the digestive tract, we add a third layer to the mucosa. So this is different from all the other organ systems in the body. We have a muscular layer that is also part of the mucosa, and we call it the muscularis mucosae. You don't need to write it down. It'll be on one of the slides coming up. So mucosa, remember I just got through saying it was 2 layers, epithelium and connective tissue. In the digestive tract, it's 3 layers, epithelium, connective tissue, and then a layer of muscle. Okay, so remember that, muscularis mucosae. Now this picture is low magnification, so we don't really see that on this image, but I'll show you on other pictures. And then, under the muscularis mucosae, we have the submucosa, which would be equivalent to the hypodermis in the skin. Okay? So it's not part of the mucosa, it's under the mucosa, so we call it submucosa. Submucosa, again, is a layer of connective tissue with large blood vessels, nerves, lymphatics, and in the digestive tract, we have a special nerve plexus, which we call the submucosal plexus, that governs several things. It stimulates the muscularis mucosae layer to contract. It also stimulates glands to secrete, and it also has some sensory fibers in it. Deep to the submucosa, we have two muscular layers. We call them together the muscularis externa. This just says muscularis. There's an intercircular layer, there's an outer longitudinal layer, and between those two layers is another nerve plexus, which we call the myenteric plexus. Myo, muscle, enteric refers to the gut or digestive tract. Myenteric plexus, also known as the Auerbach's plexus. All right? So we'll cover all these things bit by bit as we go through. And then surrounding the entire thing, we typically have a layer of peritoneum, which we call the serosa. We saw that with the lungs. Remember the lungs had the pleura on the surface, parietal pleura, visceral pleura. That's the same as serosa. Right? Now, the esophagus does not have pleura on it, so it would have an adventitia rather than a serosa. But most of the abdominal organs have serosa rather than adventitia. And we'll talk about each part of the digestive tract and what it has. So that's a general overview of the components of the digestive tract. And now we're going to go organ by organ and look at what each one has. So mucosas epithelium plus lamina propria plus muscularis mucosae, as we said before. And then there's a submucosa, which contains the submucosal plexus, also known as Meissner's plexus. And then we have the muscularis externa, which is made up of an intercircular layer, outer longitudinal layer, and the myenteric or Auerbach's plexus in between those two layers. And that's made up of nerves that stimulate contraction of those muscles. And then the serosa, which is mesothelium, and that's going to cover most of the digestive tract, but places that don't have a serosa will have an adventitia instead. So that's the general overview. All right. Now, we are going to, later in the course, do an intensive study of the oral cavity. We'll spend lots of time on the oral cavity. So for today, we're going to skip oral cavity and pharynx, and we will come back to those when we're in the head and neck part of the course. Just keep in mind that the oral cavity is part of the digestive tract, but it's a specialized part that we want to spend more time with later on, so we're going to skip that for today. So we're going to start with the esophagus. The esophagus is a muscular tube. It's approximately 25 millimeters or 10 inches in length. It transports swallowed food from the oral cavity and from the pharynx into the stomach. So the pharynx, this little tubular structure posterior to the oral cavity, transitions into the esophagus, approximately at the level of the C6 vertebra, and then travels down through the diaphragm and empties into the stomach. All right? There are the four layers that we mentioned above. So we have the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, and an adventitia. So let's look at the mucosa first. Here's a diagram taken from one of our textbooks showing the various layers of the esophagus. The epithelium is non-keratinized stratified squamous. Now, on the practical exam that we had a few weeks ago, we had a sample of stratified squamous epithelium, and some of you just put stratified squamous, and you didn't get it right even though that's what it was, because you didn't specify that it was non-keratinized. So, from here on out, you must say whether it's keratinized or non-keratinized. That's part of the description of the epithelium. Always need to put that down, because the two are different. So we need to know that you know the difference between keratinized and non-keratinized. Okay? So this is non-keratinized. Now, if you were a giraffe, it would be keratinized, because giraffes eat thorns and twigs and leaves and all kinds of rough things that if it wasn't keratinized, it would rip their poor esophagus apart, but they have a nice keratinized layer. We are not giraffes. Ours is non-keratinized. The lamina propria is just typical, so it's a connective tissue with nerves, blood vessels, lymphatics, made up of type 1 collagen, fibroblasts, that kind of stuff. And then the muscularis mucosae is mainly made up of longitudinal fibers, smooth muscle. So for the most part, the muscularis mucosae is non-voluntary. We don't control the contraction of those muscles. Now, toward the distal end of the esophagus, there is a group of glands that are called cardiac glands that are found in the lamina propria. I put cardiac in quotes because what does the word cardiac mean? It refers to the heart. And there's nothing in the esophagus that's related to the heart whatsoever. This is an old term that probably comes from a time when people thought that when you had heartburn, it was actually your heart that was burning because the heart's right in front of the esophagus, in the thorax. And so it has nothing to do with the heart whatsoever, but we continue to use this terminology, which is bad terminology. Everybody uses it. It's in the textbooks. So we continue to call these cardiac glands, even though they have nothing to do with the heart whatsoever. See, heartburn is actually gastroesophageal reflux, which is acid from the stomach coming up into the esophagus and then making the esophagus burn. And because the esophagus is right behind the heart, in olden days people thought it was your heart that was burning. So we keep using that term heartburn, which is a bad term because it has nothing to do with the heart whatsoever. Have I made myself clear? Okay. So here is a picture that John, sitting in the back of the room up there, took for me. There's a really nice picture so you can see the stratified squamous epithelium. Here's the lamina propria. Notice the nice muscular layer. This is smooth muscle, muscularis mucosae. And then below that is the submucosa, and you can see these large blood vessels in the submucosa. So here's a beautiful picture showing showing the entire mucosa, those 3 layers of mucosa, plus a little bit of the submucosa. All right, let's talk about the submucosa now. So it's dense, irregular connective tissue. It has large lymphatic vessels, large blood vessels. Here are some glands. You see to the right of that picture, there's some glands there. And it doesn't show it in this particular picture, but you will see the submucosal plexus. Now, what you will probably see is some nerve fibers, and you may see some ganglion cells. These ganglion cells are going to be of the parasympathetic variety. I mean, I don't know that you necessarily need to know that, but sympathetic ganglia are not located within the walls of organs. Sympathetic ganglia are located outside of organs. So if you see any ganglion cells within the walls of an organ, they're going to be parasympathetic. All right, just FYI. I love to tag these plexuses. So just be prepared to see plexuses on the final because there's a very good chance that you'll see those. All right, glands are present throughout the submucosa. They're mostly of the mucus variety. They may be mixed. You may have a little serous mixed in there, but they're mostly mucus. And the one you're seeing in the picture is a mucus gland. And then you have lymphocytes. It's very typical throughout the digestive tract to have lymphocyte infiltrations because the food that you eat, even if you cook it, even if you wash it, is going to be contaminated with bacteria. And so throughout the digestive tract, you have these aggregations of lymphocytes. They infiltrate the various layers. It's not unusual to see them. And so we'll point them out in various pictures. All right. The muscularis externa is made up of an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer, so it's very typical. However, this point is very important. The composition changes as you go from the upper part of the esophagus to the lower part of the esophagus. It transitions from skeletal muscle to smooth muscle. So that means that the upper part of the esophagus you can voluntarily contract, and that's what happens when you swallow. But once the food gets into the lower part of the esophagus, you no longer have control over its movement. So it transitions from skeletal to smooth. Yes? Yes. So the muscularis mucosae is an inner layer next to the lamina propria. It's part of the mucosa. This is outside the organ. It's on the outer surface of the organ, so it's a totally separate layer of muscle under different control. The muscularis mucosae is under the control of the submucosal plexus. This is under control of the myenteric plexus. Okay? Those two plexuses communicate with each other, but they do different things. So in the upper third of the esophagus, the muscles of the muscularis externa are skeletal type muscles, so they're voluntary. In the middle third, it's a combination of smooth and skeletal, so you'll see a mixture of the two. And in the lower third, it's all smooth muscle and no more skeletal. So you can see that there's sort of a transition that takes place as you move down the esophagus. And I will not ask you on the practical to identify what part of the esophagus you're in, although I could do that, but I'm not going to. Oh, it's not that hard. If you see only skeletal muscle, then you know you're in the upper third. If you see both skeletal and smooth, you know you're in the middle third. If you see only smooth, you're in the lower third. But I won't do that to you. But just be aware of that, okay? All right. Now the myenteric plexus, also called Auerbach's plexus, is located between the inner and outer layers and consists of ganglion cells, which would be parasympathetic, and nerve fibers. Skeletal muscle in the upper third is innervated by somatic fibers. That would be alpha motor neurons, is that right? Not gamma. Gamma is the muscle spindles, right? Alpha motor neurons. That's what we're talking about when we talk about somatic. So it's not autonomic. The smooth muscle is autonomic. The skeletal muscle is under somatic control. All right. Here is a picture, and John took this picture as well. So this is the inner circular and the outer longitudinal layer of muscle, and here we see a little bit of the myenteric plexus. So I don't really see any ganglion cells, or maybe a couple of ganglion cells here, but we see some nervous tissue embedded in connective tissue. So this is a good example of what the myenteric plexus looks like. It's not hard to pick out because it's sandwiched between the two layers of muscle. And if I indicate something between those two layers of muscle, that's what it's going to be. All right, let's look at our transition into the stomach now. We've gotten through the esophagus. We're transitioning to stomach. And what's really interesting histologically is that when you go from esophagus to stomach, you have an abrupt change in epithelium. Just boom, it's just, here's one type, right next to it is a different type. And there's just this abrupt change. We call that the esophagogastric junction, the junction between the stomach and the esophagus. So it's an abrupt transition from stratified squamous to simple columnar epithelium. Now you'll see cardiac glands on both sides of the junction. So you see them in the distal esophagus, and you also see them in the cardiac region of the stomach, the beginning part of the stomach. Because we want to make sure that whatever is coming into the stomach is going to be neutralized by this mucus that's being secreted. Okay? While the mucosa of the esophagus is fairly even, the mucosa of the stomach is characterized by pits. So the surface of the esophagus was fairly smooth. When you get the stomach, you're going to have all these pits extending downward from the surface. And so all of a sudden you see this transition in the type of epithelium, and you also see all these pits that weren't there in the esophagus. So here's another picture by John. He's given me some gorgeous stuff to work with. Here's our muscularis externa up here. This is submucosa here. And notice this is stratified squamous, and then all of a sudden, right here, we start seeing these little pits. Now we can't see what kind of epithelium this is because it's too low magnification. I'll show you some high mag pictures so you can see it. But notice how different this part here that's labeled stomach looks from this part over here that's labeled esophagus. It's very, very different, and you just see this abrupt change. Yes?
Is it possible to make your little pointer a little bit larger?
What I can do is use the mouse because my battery is getting weak on my pointer. So I'll use the mouse. All right. So if you look over here, this is stratified squamous. And then all of a sudden, right here, you start seeing these pits appearing. Notice? So this is actually a pit. You don't see any pits over here. But all of a sudden, you see all these pits, and the epithelium is simple columnar, although you can't see it on this diagram, but you'll see it on the neck on other slides. So that is called the esophagogastric junction. Okay. So now let's talk about the stomach. So the stomach is typically the most dilated part of the digestive tract. It can hold up to 1.5 liters. Is that right? 1.5 liters, that's a lot, I guess. So the role of the stomach is to continue the digestive process that began in the oral cavity. So the stomach is going to contain enzymes that will continue the carbohydrate digestion. Salivary amylase, have you studied that already? You know what that is? Okay, amyl refers to starch. So amylase is something that breaks down starch. So it breaks down large carbohydrates into smaller subunits. So that continues in the stomach. We have the beginning of the digestion of proteins by hydrochloric acid and pepsin. Remember, pepsin is secreted as pepsinogen. We have a gastric lipase that begins the digestion process of lipids. And then there's a special chemical called intrinsic factor that binds to vitamin B12 and makes it available. If you don't have intrinsic factor, you die. It's as simple as that. So there's a kind of anemia called pernicious anemia where there's a problem with intrinsic factor. And so those people have to have vitamin B supplements, or I don't know how you treat that, but that's a big problem. Okay, the other role of the stomach is to mix and partially digest the ingested food, and the product of that, what comes out the other end of the stomach, is called chyme. So it's a white, sort of pasty, very acidic substance that gets ejected into the first part of the small intestine, which we call the duodenum. So that is the function of the stomach. Now, anatomically, we identify 4 different regions in the stomach, and this picture on your screen shows those 4 regions. So the fundus is this part up here at the very top. So it is, before we get to the fundus, this small area here is called the cardia. There we go with cardiac again. The heart of the stomach, I don't know why they call it that, but that's what it's called. All right, so it's just a little transition zone, so that's where the esophagogastric junction opens into the cardia. And then we have the fundus, which is this part up here at the top. Now, this little notch right here is called the cardiac notch. So the fundus would be the part above that level of the cardiac notch there. So there's the cardiac notch. I'm indicating that on the picture. And then the body is just the main part of the stomach, so all of this is going to be called the body here. And then we have what we call the pylorus. So that's the terminal part. The word pylorus, by the way, means gatekeeper. So it's the gatekeeper guarding the entrance into the duodenum. All right? So there's several different parts. There's what we call the pyloric antrum, which is this big open area. There's a pyloric canal. There's a pyloric sphincter, which closes off the opening into the duodenum. All right? The inner walls of the stomach have longitudinal folds, which we call rugae. Now, I don't know in your dental classes if you've talked about the rugae on the roof of the mouth, but you have these little ridges in the anterior part of the palate. You can feel them with your tongue. So it's the same word. A rugae just means a ridge or a fold type of structure. Now, the rugae are important because when the stomach is not full, it can sort of contract down on itself and you get all these folds in the wall. And then when you fill the stomach, it stretches out and the rugae disappear. So they are just extra wall space, so to speak, that you can use to expand the stomach if you need to. All right. Now, as I just finished saying, as far as gross anatomy goes, we identify 4 parts to the stomach, but histologically, we only identify 3 parts. And it's a little bit confusing. So we have the cardiac stomach, and this is a small area where the esophagus empties into the stomach. So the cardiac stomach histologically corresponds more or less with the cardiac stomach anatomically. They're pretty much the same region. So that part's not confusing. And the glands in that region are called cardiac glands, as we've already talked about. What is confusing is what we call the fundic stomach histologically. So histologically, the fundic stomach includes both the fundus and the body of the stomach anatomically. So the main part of the stomach histologically is called the fundic stomach, and the glands in that part are called gastric glands or fundic glands. All right? And then the terminal part is the pyloric stomach, and this contains pyloric glands, which are mucus-type glands. So when I took histology, we had to differentiate histologically between cardiac, fundic, and pyloric stomach. I am not going to do that to you. So I will show you the differences in lab, but I will not require you to be able to identify those differences. But the reason why we talk about 3 different parts is because we have 3 different histologies. The histology of each region is slightly different. I'm not going to ask you to identify those differences, so you don't have to worry about that. All right, here's a picture from your textbook showing those differences. So if you look at the picture at the top, I guess I better stay here and use my mouse. Notice that we have these pits, and then at the bottom of the pits we have glands. So notice the pits are fairly shallow, the glands are fairly small, and this is just a very small portion of the stomach, so this is just right up here. The majority of the stomach is called the fundic stomach. Now your textbook labels it as body, but histologically we call it fundic. And so notice we have these deep pits that branch into glands, and we have specific types of cells in this region. We'll get to those cell types in just a moment. And then finally we have the pyloric stomach, which is the terminal part, and the glands are different. It's a different type of gland. So we'll look at those in a moment. All right, so the mucosa consists of simple columnar epithelium. Now we have pits, and if you go down into a pit, the pit will terminate as a bunch of glands at the base of the pits. The glands secrete into the pits, and then the secretion comes up through the pits to the surface of the stomach. Both the glands and the pits are lined by simple columnar epithelium. But all the cells are not of the same type. There's many different cell types in that simple columnar epithelium, and we want to talk about each type of cell and the function of each type. So at the base of so if you look at this diagram, you'll see that the upper half of this is pit, so this is the pit, and the lower part is the gland. It's sort of like, remember when we learned about the sweat glands in the skin? The beginning of the sweat gland was where the secretory cells were, and then the upper part was just where the ducts are. So here the pit would be sort of equivalent to a duct. We don't call it a duct because it's bigger than a duct, but it's sort of the function of a duct, okay? Notice there's several different types of cells. We're going to go through each type and talk about where they're located and what their function is. So let's look at the cell types. The first type is called a surface mucus cell. Now, we've talked about mucus-secreting cells before. These cells are different from all the other types of mucus-secreting cells. They secrete a very special kind of mucus, which is not your average nuts and bolts mucus. It's a very different type of mucus. We call it visible mucus, and the reason why we call it that is because if you were to cut the stomach open, you could actually see this thick layer of mucus covering the surface of the stomach. That mucus is inert chemically. So what it does is protects the stomach from its own acids. The stomach, as you probably know, the glands in the stomach secrete an acid that has a pH of around 2. And if the stomach wasn't protected from its own acid, those acids would eat through the walls of the stomach and digest the stomach. And that happens when you get an ulcer. That's what happens is the visible mucus is not adequate and acid starts burning through the walls of the stomach. That's what an ulcer is. So the surface mucus glands secrete this special kind of mucus, which we call visible mucus, which prevents damage to the stomach wall.
Right.
Yes?
So, can we see that on our cadavers, or what's the person's legs?
You won't see it on your cadavers. You can cut open the stomach if you want to. There's not going to be much in there. If the person has recently eaten, there may be a little bit of chyme in the stomach, but you won't see the mucus. Probably not. And if you do, it's going to have coagulated, and so it won't look like normal mucus. That's a great question. All right, the next kind of cell also produces mucus, but it produces the regular kind of mucus. And so we call this a mucus neck cell. We call it a mucus neck because it's located in the neck region of the gland. So these sort of light pink cells are the mucus neck cells. All right, then we have a very important cell. This is called the parietal cell. What does the word parietal mean? Yeah, it means walls. So I guess these are called parietal cells because they're found in the walls of the pits. I don't know why they call them parietal cells. But these cells have a very unique histology, and I will ask you to be able to identify parietal cells. They're easy to pick out. They are bright pink, they're big and round, they're plump, and what you can't see under the microscope is that they have these special little structures which we call intracellular canaliculi. And that greatly increases the surface area of the cell for secretion. So they're stimulated by parasympathetic innervation and also by paracrine release of histamine and gastrin. So histamine is released by cells like mast cells, and gastrin is a hormone that's released by the endocrine cells in the digestive tract. Okay, so typically these are large, they're more or less pyramid or rounded in shape, they have a spherical nucleus. The cytoplasm is very eosinophilic, very pink, so they stand out, they're easy to see because they're big and pink. They have these intercellular canaliculi which open into the lumen. You can see that here. But they also have, and it doesn't show up very well in this picture, it's labeled but you can't really see it. They have what's called a tubulovesicular system. And this is made up of membranes. These membranes are rich in proton pumps, and what can happen is they can be inserted into the walls of the intracellular canaliculi to increase their surface area. So it's basically stored membrane that can be added to the surface or added to the intercellular canaliculi if you want to increase the surface area. And when you're diminishing the surface area, they go back into storage. So it's basically stored membrane is what that is. Okay? Here are a couple of diagrams so you can see the intracellular canaliculi. Notice that there's lots and lots of microvilli in here. And on the other side of the slide, you have the tubulovesicular system. So this is spare membrane that can be inserted into the cell's membrane to increase surface area. This picture also shows how acids are produced. So hydrochloric acid is secreted by these cells, and this sort of shows the mechanism. You have carbonic anhydrase. We've already met carbonic anhydrase before when we talked about the osteoclast. So it's the same mechanism here to produce hydrochloric acid. All right? So, what do those cells do? I don't know if did I forget to put the function? So the two main functions of these cells, make sure you write this down, they produce hydrochloric acid and they produce intrinsic factor. So the parietal cells, very important cells, they are what create the acidic environment in the stomach. They produce hydrochloric acid, pH around 2, and they produce intrinsic factor, which is necessary for the utilization of vitamin B12. So these cells are extremely important cells. I mean, all cells are important. But. All right, the next set of cells is called chief cells. Chief, in this case, means the main cell type. So there are more of these cells than of any of the other cell types in the fundic part of the stomach. And they produce pepsinogen, which becomes pepsin, and they also produce gastric lipase. So they are an enzyme-producing cell. And so they are going to have the features of a protein-producing cell, which means their cytoplasm is going to be more basophilic, lots of rough ER, lots of Golgi, and so forth. Okay. A typical protein-producing cell. And then we have the endocrine cells. We call them enteroendocrine because entero refers to the digestive tract, the gut or intestine. And so we call these enteroendocrine cells. Now there's a whole list of names that people have called these cells in the past. Arginophin cells, DNES cells, blah, 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 blah. I'm just going to stick with enteroendocrine and hope that nobody asks you the other names. Okay? So these are located down in the gland part. They secrete various hormones that regulate digestive function. Right? So all along the digestive tract you have these cells. So they're not only in the stomach, they're also in the duodenum, they're also in the small intestine, the large intestine. They're important. And then finally, we have stem cells, and these are found both in the pits and the glands, and they produce all the other cell types. So they're stem cells for all the other epithelial cells that we've mentioned up to this point. Okay. The only two cells that I will ask you to identify out of all these cell types are the chief cells and the parietal cells. I want you to be able to identify both of those. The other cells, know about them, but you don't have to identify them histologically. All right, so here's a picture, a couple of pictures. If you look at the one on your left, it says C and P. C stands for chief and P stands for parietal. So notice the purple cells here. Those are the chief cells. And these large pink cells are the parietal cells. So their staining is very, very different. They're easy to differentiate. Once again, on this picture on your right, The big pink cells are the parietal cells, and these more nondescript blue or purple cells are the chief cells. So parietal cells are easy to pick out. Okay, lamina propria is connective tissue, and we find it between the pits and glands. So squeezing between all those pits and glands, we have lamina propria. And in addition to the typical stuff, there's also lots of lymphoid cells, lymphocytes, and so forth. Muscularis mucosae is just a distinct band of connective muscle. So the arrow in these pictures, the arrows are pointing to the muscularis mucosae. You see this pale pink band right here? That is the muscularis mucosae. So that is the boundary between the mucosa and the submucosa. The submucosa is typical. It's typical connective tissue with large blood vessels, lymphatics, and so forth, and includes the submucosal plexus. And then the muscularis externa. Now, the stomach is unique. Rather than having 2 layers of muscle, it has 3, but all the layers are incomplete, and they're sort of indistinct. So I won't ask you on a tissue section or on the cadaver to be able to identify the different layers, but just be aware that there's 3 layers. So there's an outer longitudinal layer, a middle circular layer, an inner oblique layer. None of them are complete layers. They don't cover the whole stomach. And they thoroughly mix the stomach content with the hydrochloric acid and the enzymes, and they produce chyme. The middle layer becomes thickened at the pylorus to form the pyloric sphincter. Now, I don't know if we've talked about the word sphincter or not. It's an important word, so this is the time to learn it. A sphincter is a layer of circular muscle fibers that closes off the opening of a tubular structure. And I personally am very thankful for my sphincters, because if my sphincters weren't working, well, to be blunt, I'd have to wear diapers all the time. Because you'd be leaking urine and you'd be leaking feces all the time. So that's 2 places where we have sphincters. We have urinary sphincters, we have anal sphincters, and at the junction between the stomach and the duodenum we have a sphincter. So the food in the stomach is not allowed to leave until the stomach digestion is complete. And then that sphincter opens and the stomach squirts that stuff into the duodenum. So a sphincter is a little round muscle that closes off the openings. Your lips are actually like a sphincter. You can pull them tight and prevent anything from going in. So lips are kind of a sphincter. All right, and then you have serosa covering the stomach, which is peritoneum. Here is a picture from Netter's atlas showing the various layers. So you see the longitudinal layer here, and you can see that it's incomplete. You see the circular layer here, and then we cut the circular layer, and here's the oblique layer in there. And then here you can see the pyloric sphincter, these circular muscles that close off the link between stomach and duodenum. Man, I redid this lecture so I could make it shorter so I could get through it in time, and I'm still not going to get through it in time. All right, small intestine is the site where digestion is complete, where nutrients are absorbed. It's about 5 to 6 meters in length, so it's really, really, really long. Are you guys looking at pictures of sphincters? It consists of 3 different regions. I see people passing pictures around. 3 different regions. The first part is called the duodenum. Duodenum comes from a Latin term, which comes from a Greek term, which means 12 fingers. So it was originally named that because the length of it is about 12 finger breadths long. That's where the name comes from. Some people say duodenum. It doesn't matter how you say it. Jejunum is the second part. It's the part located in the upper left quadrant. I think we already looked at that in gross anatomy lab the other day. Jejunum means empty, because when people first started studying the body, they found that when they cut open this part, it was usually empty. So that's where the name jejunum comes from. And I'm embarrassed to say that I looked up the meaning of ileum and I can't remember what it means. I think it refers to that area of the body where it's located. So the ileum is the terminal part, and Dr. Escobar told you how to distinguish between those different things. We're not going to worry about that in histology. So the mucosa has folds in it. This is an open view of the intestine. You can see these folds. The Latin word for fold is plica, and they're circular, so plica circularis just means circular folds. And so those increase the surface area of the walls of the small intestine. The mucosa is arranged in finger-like projections called villi. So if you look at this picture up here, you can see these little projections. Each one is called a villus, is covered by epithelium, and the core of each villus is lamina propria. That's important to remember, because when you look at histological sections, you're going to be confused. So remember that the epithelium was on the outside, and the core of each villus is lamina propria. So if you were to do a cross-section through a villus, it would look like this, with lamina propria in the middle. If you did a cross-section through a crypt, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, there'd be a hole in the middle, rather than lamina propria. So a lot of the intestine you're going to look at under the microscope is going to be cut in cross-section, rather than longitudinal section. So you got to be used to seeing it both ways, both kinds of cuts. All right, the crypts are these little pit-like structures. In the stomach, we call them pits. In the intestine, we call them crypts. Now, here's the difference between crypt and pit. In the stomach, remember that there's nothing projecting above the surface. There's only these pits going down below the surface, and those end in glands at the bottom. Here, you have these finger-like projections sticking up from the surface, so the crypts are going below the surface between the villi, and they don't have glands at the bottom. They are the gland. Okay, so they're a little different than the pits we saw in the stomach. Okay, both villi and crypts are lined by simple columnar epithelium. And again, we have different cell types. So this is a great picture. This is another John picture. John, you got some marvelous histology pictures. Thank you so much. So these fingers that we see sticking up are the villi. And notice that they have connective tissue as their core. Now we see lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of little purple dots. Those are lymphocytes that have infiltrated, and that's normal for the digestive tract to have lots of lymphocytes. So we have epithelium on the surface, simple columnar. We have lamina propria in the core, and then this pink band here is our, whoops, I didn't mean to click that, sorry. That is our muscularis mucosae, this pink band right here. And so, now look at this slide for a minute. Pay attention to this slide. This thing extending up here is one of those plica circularis. Right? This whole thing here is a plica, a fold. So in the core of the plica, you have submucosa. Extending from each plica, you have lots of villi. Between the villi, you have the crypts. So these are the little crypts extending downward from between the villi. You can see the bases of the crypts here. Now it looks like these are just little round balls. That's because they got cut in cross-section rather than longitudinal section. If you cut them in longitudinal section, they're going to look more like this. So you can see the crypts are like test tubes. I keep hitting that button, sorry. All right, so remember that each plica is going to be covered with dozens of villi. The core of each villus is lamina propria. The core of the plica is submucosa. Between the lamina propria and submucosa, you're going to have muscularis mucosae. So if you can remember all that, then you'll be able to identify this pretty well. And then down here at the bottom of the picture, we can see a little bit of our muscularis externa. If I could get my mouse to work. Yeah, so this down here at the bottom is the muscularis externa. All right, moving forward. The epithelium then is made up of simple columnar cells, which are called enterocytes. These are absorptive cells. So these cells are absorbing the products of digestion and putting them into the bloodstream. Okay? So these have an ovally, basally located nucleus. You can see the big nuclei here. And the apical end is covered with what we call a brush or striated border, and that's actually microvilli, so you can see that quite nicely in this picture. And then the other main cell type is the goblet cell. You're already familiar with goblet cells. What do they produce? Mucus. They are mucus-secreting cells. So G in this picture stands for goblet cell. Okay? So they're between the enterocytes. Now, at the base of the crypts, underline that, at the base of the crypts, in the depths of the crypts, you have a special type of cell called the Paneth cell. And the only place you see it is in the base of the crypts, and the only organ you see it in is small intestine. So this is going to be one of the big identifying features, along with villi and all that stuff, that this is small intestine. Because you've got to be able to differentiate between esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine. You've got to be able to identify that. So this is one of the big key identifiers. Paneth cells. I put the word Paneth cells in this bright orange color because that's the color of the cells. They have these big granules in them. You can see them here. See all these little orange or reddish granules? Those cells are Paneth cells. So they contain lysozyme, phospholipase A2, defensins, and they are part of the immune system. So they're there to help control the bacteria population. Okay? Then we have the enteroendocrine cells, which we've already talked about. So they're interspersed between the other cells. And if you have your textbook, in table 15.1, it lists the different types of hormones that are produced and what those hormones do. I'm not going to test you over that, but you do need to know that information probably for your physiology class. So that's a nice summary of the various types of hormones, which cells produce them, and what they do. Now, in part of the small intestine, oh shoot, my time is up. I'm going to give you a break right here. We have another lecture at 11 o'clock, so I'm going to give you a 10-minute break, and then I'm just going to try to finish this up, and we'll get as far into the next lecture as we can. Okay, but I want to finish this one. So take a break,